Okay, Stephen J., here's to you. Part two. I hope you enjoy. And I really want to throw out some thanks to Rilla Evelyn Jackman, who from well, his book came out, I think, in 1925 or so, The American Arts. And some of you have already said you've gotten a copy of it. It's really well worth your time to, if you're an American, or if you want to just follow up on an area of art at a particular time in the world's history that was beginning to become sort of significantly up and coming, making its mark in the world before the double World War nonsense and all the rest of that. But so let me just page in here a little bit. I've covered a lot of stuff, and I'm just sometimes impressed with how much more I can cover, how much more there is to see. So I'm just going to page a couple pages in. It's kind of the fun for me is to make Mr. Producer have to follow my video this way. And by the way, there's some other essays at the beginning of this thing that are pretty interesting on landscape painting and other things. But I'm just trying to show you the names of certain of the individuals. So I'm showing you how it works, right? So some of these chapters, the Impressionist movement, independent painters continued. Is that what they continued? Portrait and figure. And it sort of talks about American and French classic training and names the guys that are in those classes. You can see how it works. It's quite wild, and just the list of all these guys. Here's Joseph de Camp showing up under portrait and figure painting, which was the, I don't know what that's, okay. In any case, you can see what's going on here is there's all sorts of classifications and interesting, and then there's a whole list of people that go under it. So one of the things that's happening today is, I don't think I've talked about a little bit. I've mentioned some of these people, a couple of the cowboy painters. But most of the painters I'm talking about today had educations in Europe, not all of them. But people like Bonnat and the École des Beaux-Arts, I assume would have meant Jerome at the time some of these were there. But what's interesting about this new group I'm looking at is how many of them, most of this whole body of people is born somewhere in the middle of the century. 1851 is the earliest, and I think the latest is 1886 or something like that. But let's just start looking at pictures. You sort of had an idea how this works, So, but those people, if you want to pause it for a second and look at those, some of these other names, I could have used a lot of other people. These are my favorites of the people I went through, and some of them didn't have pictures, some of them did in the book, but there's a huge number of pictures in the book. It's worth it for that reason. They're all black and white. It was believed in those days that black and white's going to give you a better reproduction. The color wasn't up to any kind of snuff. So let's just go on then to Joshua S.'s question. I was curious if you could talk about some of the artists that you think might get overlooked. For example, I'm a big fan of William Merritt Chase, Mary Cassatt, and Cecilia Beaux, but I feel you don't hear much about them, except maybe Mary Cassatt. Well, I feel like you do hear about those two guys, William Merritt Chase and Mary Cassatt. Of course, I was in New York, and that was, in some sense, that was all you heard about around the Art Students League, and he was a big influence. One of our guys today, Louis Betts, is one of those guys that I think primarily may have studied with him primarily, I should say. And you can see where that's coming from. He rather looks like somewhere between Sargent and Duveneck in the way he handles things. But he says, but I feel you don't hear much about them except maybe Mary Cassatt. I'd be interested if you could bring to light some other strong artists that you believe have the right stuff. So, yeah, it's it's a matter of, my sensing whether it's the right stuff or not. But you judge, is it the right stuff? Some of these images I'm going to show like this with my face, and other times I'm going to be full screening them. There are a couple of different guys I'd like to full screen for your benefit. But William, I want to say Gaunt or Launt, what was his middle name? Palmer. What's Not to Love? This is 1851. So this is 10 years before the Boston School guys. And by the way, the next first 5 or 6 of the first 7 or 8 painters are 1851. Fascinating. But this would be right before the strong influence of the Impressionists. This thing is very, very beautiful in a sense, in the way that Boston School Impressionism is trying to get that full atmosphere per color as well as values. But they were more heavily righteous on the values, shall we say, focused on the values. So there's Palmer. What's not to love? He did a series in this area with these fascinating boats and that sort of thing. But so that's the first guy. And this isn't going to be a long one, as I said before. It's just really a review. I'm not going to tell you I know all the histories of these guys. I know about some of them, like Mowbray here. I believe he was a student of Bonnat. So this is coming out of the era of the Orientalist period, and a lot of his work is in that class. You can see the influence of it here. But these two are, to me, as nice as anything he did. Here again, 1851. So it's I would say that even though it's there on some level, the impressionist mindset has not struck, hasn't really come all the way into its influence. So that's Mowbray. Oh, what's his first name? I forget. Something rather, Arthur Siddons Mowbray. Sometimes I know these guys' his whole name, sometimes I don't. I've known them from way back. One thing I recommend you all do is just look at lots of pictures. Every time you see a catalog, I have one, well back there, Christie's catalog or a Sotheby's catalog, especially Sotheby's. Sotheby's catalogs have reproduced stuff in color better than anybody else I've ever seen anywhere. Very few books reproduce, and I think it's probably because they want to make sure people are going to get what they see. What they see on the catalog is what they're going to get when they walk into the, to pick up their purchase. This is an auction house we're talking about now, in New York, I think. I should say I know. Charles Sprague Pearce, another one of those guys like Daniel Ridgway Knight. His background again is Bonnat. The Bonnat influence. So you're really seeing, Bonnat was the guy that Jerome would have in if he wasn't able to be there for a little while, be on vacation or whatever. But you can easily see, if you know Bonnat's work, you can easily see the influence. It's very striking. This is academic painting. This is Americans educated in academic painting. This probably isn't Academy Julian. Bonnat didn't teach there. And so he probably was in Bonnat's actual atelier, and numbers of these guys were. So now Louis Betts here, that's what I'm saying. I believe his influence is almost entirely, in 1851 again, his influence is entirely from the Chase side of things. Chase was a Duveneck boy, and you can see the mark making here. Somewhere between sort of Duveneck and Sargent is what his strongest inclination is. In his work, it's surprisingly uneven. In fact, it falls off remarkably fast from a couple of very strong pieces. But nevertheless, he's got something going on here, at least from that point of view of sort of the grand gesture of Sargent, or that sort of life of a child's face, and all of these I'm assuming were done from life. I just don't think anything else is even slightly likely. They have another quality that photographs don't give you. But here's Howard Pyle. And, what's not to like? This guy's an illustrator, as they say, but these are paintings, right? These are paintings, but the approach to painting here is so much like, Detail or Meissonier, some of those French painters who probably were born 20 or 30 years earlier than Pyle, but he was the teacher and the great influence on numbers of illustrators, and I'm particularly thinking of N.C. Wyeth. And you can probably get that feeling in that left painting. So there's Howard Pyle. What was his background? I'm not going to say it's random, but he had sort of these, I think, as I understand it, he had sort of these wars with schools. Don't take my word for it. There's some sense in which he's a self-made man, but he's obviously better than that. So in 1851, so here's Laura Coombs Hills. We've talked about her. You've seen that picture on the right before. Maybe not the one on the left. The one on the left is, both of these are pastels. And my guess is the one on the left conceivably could be a miniature, but I don't think it is. And I don't even know whether it's life-size or under life-size, but there's some very beautiful work here. You can see the drawing quality is outstanding. She had my remembrance of her is that she had time at I would think it was Helen Knowlton or somebody in the Boston area. and then came back and studied some more. But that was a painter who was influenced by William Morris Hunt. But this is superb pastel. This is magical as it gets. One on the right is at the Museum of Fine Arts. I don't know where the left one is. So that's 1859. 1861. Now let's go ahead and, since we're there, let's go ahead and jump to Remington for a second. 1861. And Remington, again, you read anything about these guys, you'll find out that they were a little on the wild side, these cowboy painters, in terms of getting an education. They're a little bit random, but I actually looked up his story here, and I recommend you read it. It's one of the most curious, rides into the field of painting, as you'll see. Eventually, he does wind up with some formal training and all, but I don't know where. Maybe the art students like whatever. But this is cowboy art. And we've talked about it briefly before. I don't know how much. Several of them were teaching. Were really made a thing out of night, out of painting moonlight and stuff like that. I don't know why. Maybe the washed out quality. If I'm from Colorado, some of these guys are Montana. I remember first running into Russell. People conflate sometimes Remington and Russell. They're very similar subjects and obviously cowboy work. And I was in Helena, Montana, and just found a whole museum dedicated to Russell's work, sculpture and other stuff, as well as paintings. But Remington is like him, and I'm gonna jump ahead to Russell just because I only have one picture here, but it gives you a sense that their subject matter. Obviously, there was some fascination with the West. Even Simmons, I talked about last week, had some urge to go west. So, but this is already 1864. Let's go back to the 1861 guys, and so now I'm going to talk about Waugh, Frederick Waugh. Not that I want to say much about him, but have you ever seen any location in the history of painting, anybody who handles the sea as authentically as this, as plausibly as this? And again, I'm not going to pretend that I know the sea. Okay, so I'm a Western guy. I'm more Montana than I am Maine, where some of this is. But he started to earn a serious living in England. What was his background? I want to say he worked with some academics, maybe Glare. I can't. I'm not sure I know, but he was in France, but these works, he began to do works like this and having success in England, and then he came back to the States and wound up in Maine and 2 or 3 other coastal places. I think he went inland too. Some of these guys, I'm thinking, well, maybe, but I'm not going to speculate. You guys should look this up if that interests you. The history, the specific history. But anytime you see a really good painter, I recommend you look at it and look at the teachers and find out how long they spent and what sort of things they had to do to gain their knowledge. This isn't come at by talent. This is knowledge-based picture making. What's not to love? In recent times, I want to commend my friend Gary Hoffman for doing some memory work based on the sea and for getting some of this very similar kinds of qualities, the swells of the sea and things like that. And I believe was it a night picture I saw, Gary, that one of our mutual friends owns? So now we're getting into the Taos, or I think that's how it's still pronounced. You can confuse that with the Chinese Tao, but Taos, New Mexico scene. And I think this was, I don't know, there was a thing called the Taos something or other, and it was an organization where these guys got together and mutually supported each other and that sort of thing. But they were essentially Indian painters, Western artists. But Irving Kaus, again, I believe you're talking about somebody here who had training with a number of academics. And you can see that influence. It's very reminiscent of what you saw in who am I saying? George DeForest Brush, who worked with Jerome. So I believe Kaus may have worked with Jerome as well as possibly with someone like, I'm thinking maybe Bonnat. But so these are products of the academic influence. And And again, you're looking at that bottom one. Look at that patterning. Look at the magic. Just fun to see a picture like that. It's got something, doesn't it? It has that special something. By the way, his frequently his subject matter is Indian craftsmen. Doing what is he doing here? Yeah, it looks like he's doing paintings on hide, and the other ones show Indians carving in the stone, say in a cave or whatever. Fascinating stuff. And their color is very, very live, and the overall thing is live in color. Whereas a lot of the early Remington Russell stuff is pretty dead, and that's why I'm wondering if possibly they were moving toward evening light. Blumenschein is fascinating to me because of his Art Deco qualities. He's an 1874 painter. That's when he was born. And I have totally forgotten if I ever knew what his education was, but it's more of the same. French academic stuff. I want to say primarily, but again, you can look that up for yourself. But there's something very, very Deco strong in his work. There's something very Deco about it, and I say that as the Ars Nouveau, the Art Deco. These are styles of painting, as it were. They sort of form up. If you've never had the experience, if you live in the Denver area, some guy created a little museum there, and each room is dedicated to a period, like a decade, and it's fascinating. He's got these toasters and telephones and all these things from these different periods. And it's so striking how each period has unique aesthetics. And so a lot of, like car manufacturing or phone making and stuff might have been influenced by Deco at a certain point, the 40s, 50s, whatever. And but you wouldn't know it. It's worthwhile sometimes to get your head around that sort of thing. As I said, I'm not a big fan of style for its own sake. On the other hand, I love it. When I say for students, the worst thing you can do is try to do style at the expense of truth. But there's a thing. Sometimes you walk out and you just see form, the dominance of form and the interplay of forms, and it turns itself into something, right? And I say form meaning the 3D, I want to say the word shade, but it's just the 3D blobs, the 3D elements interplaying throughout the screen. And if you haven't watched it, by the way, I recommend Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow as a movie. If you really want to get another sense of what Art Deco also does, what someone might do with it in the movies. It was done. This movie is maybe 20 years old, maybe a little older than that, but it's really striking in its incorporation and full incorporation right through of these, especially the pattern making, like getting 5 guys firing cannons all lined up the same way across a page. Just numbers of influences that are fascinating, but they give you a heads up about what style is, and Blumenschein's one of those guys. I want to tell you he was the Jerome background, and here's Betty Paxton, Elizabeth Paxton. This is William Paxton's beautiful wife, who features in significant numbers of his paintings. I don't know about most, and but she was a very good artist in her own right, with a very good education. Ultimately, I think she was Boston School guys. I'm thinking to camp probably more than anybody else, and then she had the life with Paxton, so she would have had that influence. Sometimes her work doesn't look like it's very much different from Paxton, William Paxton's own stuff. But I thought you might enjoy seeing those. She did a number of these, like roughed up bedroom things. Instead of making the bed, let's just paint. She'd figured out life. So, yeah. All these painters, I recommend you do dig into them deeper if they amuse you. But this is American painting. This is, and this is 1878. But these are well-educated painters. They're not, the American thing, I don't know if it's the Puritan thing or what it was, but the American thing definitely incorporated until maybe the 30s or so, till maybe around the Ashcan era, they really incorporated a dedication to truth, to making a thing like, as Tarbell would say, very decidedly spoken about in the Boston School conversation. And she's no slacker in that way. And yet these are. And by the way, the one at the bottom left there, I've never seen that in color before. It's surprising to me how much nicer it is. I don't dislike it. I'm not a fan of the composition in black and white, but this thing in color is significantly pleasing. Over what I'd seen. So let's see, is there one more person, maybe two? At least Hibbard. Yeah, I started with snow. How about we end with snow too? This is Aldro Hibbard. So Aldro Hibbard did the whole 7-year program at the school, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and would have been under Tarbell, Benson, all those guys. Maybe a little bit under Paxton, but I kind of don't think so. Hale probably, but Hibbard is a very interesting guy. He loved the snow, or he got his biggest, his greatest subject was snow stuff, and he has some fascinating stories. There are 2 or 3 books out. One of them by Judy Curtis, which I really would recommend you have a look at. But he really got some sort of something out of being out there in cold weather. But look at how, and this is characteristic of his work, of the best of it, that it's fully embodying the Boston School, what would you call the atmosphere, that unified atmosphere that you get from that Boston School training. And yet he's using a very big brush sort of mentality. It's almost, I don't think he ever did, but frequently it looks like it's chunked on there with palette knives. But I've forgotten the date he died. Some people in the studio actually had met Hibbard. But nevertheless, here is a guy who's 7 years older than Gamel. So Gamel's situation was that he didn't get that education, but partly because our guys, the studio, the museum school was taken over by administrators, and the painters refused to participate. The good guys, the Tarbell, the Bensons, whatever, they all left. I guess Paxton came back and worked under this guy, but under those conditions. But Hibbard was blessed to be able to do the 7 years thing, and numbers of other people did too. Did I leave out Gertrude Page? I didn't mean to, but maybe we'll just leave it at that for tonight. And I wonder if there's anything worthwhile by going back through it. But the dedication to truth, and yet not at the expense of your own personality. These guys all have their own personality, their own character, and they had sought out good educations. But this is an example of the solidity of the education you could get at the museum school in Boston at that time. Not there now, of course. So Elizabeth Paxton. I can't believe I left out Gertrude Page. I meant to show some of her portraits. Blumenschein, the Taos School. Irving Caus. Russell. Waugh. What's not to love? What's not to love about these guys? Laura Coombs Hills. Just solid stuff. This is real knowledgeable people. Even the illustrators, I mean, that's powerful. 1853, way back there in before the great influence of Impressionism. Monet was, who knows what year this would have been, but but the influence was slower in coming. It really did hit hard in the our guys, which is people in the 1860s, and you can see that more with the Laura Coombs Hills. That influence is already heavier. She might have. No, she wasn't. I was going to say she might have been one of those long-term students, but she was not at the museum school in Boston. The museum school in Boston had the respect of European painters, and it was highly regarded as being as good an institution as you could have found anywhere. The museum school's training under Otto Grundmann eventually, of course, it was taken over by Tarbell and Benson. So these are guys you may or may not have heard of. I refer to some of them, not Betts. I don't much refer to Pearce or to Mowbray or to Charles Ridgway Knight. Is that his first name? but they are very impressive painters in their own right. Mowbray, I want to say, was a student of you may see a little bit of who was Sargent's teacher, Carolus Duran. I believe Mowbray may have worked with Carolus Duran. And so again, Palmer, there's a person named Adelaide Palmer who was in the area we're in. She was near us in a town called Piermont, New Hampshire. And I've had a chance to see handfuls of her pictures, and she really had a nice training as well. Not Impressionism, and it was landscape and still life primarily. But, so a lot of more of the brown and all that sort of stuff. Maybe somebody coming out of the Munich background, who knows? But there were a lot of good painters in this country, a lot of qualified painters, people who were not shirkers in any way. One thing I'd love to just mention for a second is the evolution of art has always been a slow one. They say about you that you're not going to be that much different from your parents. Almost no matter what. You will be. You'll try to be better in certain ways and avoid certain pitfalls. But painting is much the same thing. It doesn't have these dramatic evolutions that the modernists are claiming. Just all of a sudden, 1950 we have the triumph of expressionism in this country. All abstract painting, and just out of the blue, just completely out of the blue. It wasn't something shouldn't say completely, but nearly. It was coming in already in the 1880s or something like that. With some of the German, Russian painters, but the schools, were significantly taken over by this sudden and abrupt mindset. Suddenly it was about. I would say it was a dislocation of the human psyche. Really, what happened with that? It's one of those effects the arts have. There's a certain stability in the slow evolution of painting. It's cultural stability, and the sudden and abrupt stuff isn't a healthy thing in my view, and wasn't a healthy thing for painting. And we all who really loved this had as I've said many times before, we had our legs cut out from under us. It was very difficult for me to find a place where I could get an education. I mean, Gammel was a pure miracle. And so much of what's coming out now is bringing back, what we all loved, bringing it back and getting back into the stream again, was a product of Gammel's teaching and painting and writing. So huge amounts of it, through Lax, some other people, Robert Douglas Hunter, Bob Cormier, some others. So. Yeah, that's that world. So Joshua, I hope you that's something. Anytime you guys have somebody, 2 or 3 people, if you want to send images to me, I can consider them for a conversation. I've said before, my primary thing here is not, to be a travelogue, to be a historian, to be a tour guide through museums. So there's value in it, but my primary thing is really related to the Boston School and a particular methodology and stuff that relates to that. I ran into someone, a Lax student, just yesterday. He emailed me and talking about something he's writing, which is very quality stuff. But I ran into some of that same body of thinking that believes that academic and impressionist, like the Boston School, is an academic impressionist thing out of Gérôme and all that sort of stuff. And nothing could be further from the truth. And so, but the values associated with the Boston School, they're all over the place in some of this work, true, even when it's academic. So there's a stream going through all this stuff, and I like to think of it as a golden thread or something where if you're working academically, if you're working, more impressionistically, whichever that range or area, whatever that whatever that look is, or whatever that strong attraction is for you. Even the decorative we talked about with Jules Guerin last week, whatever that is, there is this underlying element that has so much simply to do with the beauty, the beauty. But what I'm significantly talking about and love to, and am most beneficial to you talking about probably really is the methodology of the Boston School. And you've seen lots and lots of videos on here talking about that. Nevertheless, I get a kick out of this too. In that era of the 60s, I mean, that was our guy, 62. There's this whole bunch of 61 guys in here, and some earlier, some later. But the 1860s, my goodness, everybody was able at that point to get over to Europe. Lots and lots and lots of people, even relatively poor kids, were able to get over to Europe and get a decent education, thanks to the various ateliers extant over there that opened arms to the Americans. So so there it is, Joshua. Thank you all. Thank you all for your continuing donations and sharing, liking, comments. In particular, Stephen, thank you for all you've done for us. And I hope you're feeling okay today. And God bless. Okay, see you all next week. Have a good painting week.